Hello folks, and welcome to the briefing on the what, when, and how of the FHWA Maintaining Pavement Marking Retroreflectivity Rule. I am Greg Driscoll. I'm the President, CEO, and founder of PPP Transportation Safety Innovations, and also the ATSA National Past Chair. So welcome today. So first of all, let's talk about who is here. About 73% of those folks that are viewing this video have been from a county or local agency or a federal or state agency, which is great because that's exactly who we're trying to get the message out to. We do have some contractors and engineering firms, about 13%, and about 7% are manufacturers. So welcome everyone, and my goal is to make sure that when I'm done here, you have the information you need to move forward on ensuring that your roads are safer for the mothers, fathers, sons, and daughters that drive on them and work on them every day. So let's get started with the history of this rule. So the Department of Transportation and Related Agencies Appropriations Act of 1993 said that we need to revise the Manual Uniform Traffic Control Devices so that it will have minimum levels of retroreflectivity to be maintained on pavement markings and signs for any road that's open to public travel. Well, in 2007, which would be, let's see, that's 14 years later, we had a final rule come out for maintaining the minimum levels of retroreflectivity for signs. This had a 5-year compliance requirement. We'll talk about what compliance means in a moment. Then, in September of 2022, just recently, there was a final rule put out for maintaining minimum levels of retroreflectivity on pavement markings. Again, 2022, which is almost 30 years later. Wow. It took us 30 years to get this in place, but let me tell you, I am so glad it is in place, and I'm thankful for it actually being enforced being forced to maintain minimum retroreflectivity on pavement markings, and we'll talk more about why. And it has a 4-year compliance. So why did they do this? They said, well, the purpose is to have minimum retroreflectivity is to advance safety and mobility and assist in nighttime visibility needs of drivers. If I was writing this today, I would say nighttime visibility needs of drivers and of connected and automated vehicles. And understand that connected and automated vehicles are not those vehicles that drive down the road at breakneck speeds with no steering wheel. We're talking about the cars we drive and we buy today with their driving assistance systems that use these markings to maintain that vehicle in that travel lane and to alert you or to make correction when it is not, or when it starts to veer from that travel lane. These markings are very important for those cars and for us as human drivers. So when does this take place? As I said, as of September 22nd, they put this in. The compliance date is September 5th, 2026, which is 4 years away. So what are they requiring? So what does compliance mean? So this requires that the agency creates or puts in place an assessment or management method to maintain retroreflectivity above or at the established minimum levels. So again, this is to put in place to be compliant, you have to have an assessment or management method in place by the end of these 4 years. This does not include compliance dates for the replacement of these pavement markings. So what they're saying is, hey, you have to have a management system in place, but we're not going to say that you have to have all your markings replaced within that certain length of time. You just need to have that assessment or management method put in place. So where? Any road that's open to the public that has greater than or equal to 6,000 ADT, that has a posted speed at or above 35 miles an hour, and longitudinal lines only. We're going to talk more about my issues with longitudinal lines only in a few moments, but remember, this is only relevant to the longitudinal lines. Those are what we normally call lane lines. So what is the compliance? Well, or what is the requirement? The requirement is that if you have a road that is posted below a 35-mile-an-hour speed limit, this compliance is not applicable. Now, if you have a road that is 35 miles an hour or more posted speed limit, it is 50 millicandela per meter squared per lux. Now, I'll talk about that in just a moment, what that means. So if you have a road, and most local and county agencies do not have these roads, but many state agencies do, that have a posted speed at or above 70 miles an hour, they need to be at 100 millicandela per meter squared per lux. Now, this is using what we call 30-meter geometry, and that's the standard geometry that all of our instruments that we buy today in the United States are at 30-meter geometry. Now, just a quick lesson. First of all, these are very low numbers, especially the 50 millicandela. In fact, I'm very concerned about that low number. We'll talk about that in a few moments, but these are low numbers. So for good reason. I understand that they didn't want to cause a deep financial impact on the cities and counties by putting in these requirements, but 50 is definitely a doable number. 30-meter geometry is just the angles in which we measure and the units in which we measure a pavement marking. Basically, we look out 30 meters, we have the headlights go out at start at a certain height, they go out, they hit, that light comes back, reflects back to the recorder or the eyes, and there's a gap there and an angle, and all that's calculated out 30 meters, and so that's how that's measured. So just don't let it get too complicated. 30-meter geometry is what we use, and we do refer to millicandelas per meter squared per lux. If you want to learn more about that, please join us in our Retroreflectivity 101 course. It'll go over 30-meter geometry. It goes over the units in which we measure, what a millicandela is, what a candela is, and so forth. So please join us in that. But again, 35 to 69 miles an hour, basically, 50 millicandela, and 100 millicandela for anything posted 70 or greater. Where are they not required to be in compliance? Well, anywhere that there is adequate illumination. Now, there are some areas in which I have some conflict with, personally, just from my experience and expertise in this industry. Ambient illumination is one of those. So ambient illumination means, of course, like overhead lighting and so forth. If there's adequate is very ambiguous, but if there's adequate ambient light illumination, then you don't need to have this required minimum 50 millicandela or 100 millicandela. Now, I have an issue with that because the overhead lights will flood out the pavement marking, basically blending the pavement marking into the pavement surface, just simplifying it. And so therefore, it's actually harder to see that line up ahead of you than it would be if you didn't have ambient lighting. So why we don't have the need in ambient lighting, I'm not really sure, but it can create an issue. I've done a couple posts and gave some examples showing that our visual distance of pavement markings at the same retroreflective levels, it's not as far when we have ambient illumination than when we do not have ambient illumination. So anyway, an area I have concern with, but FHWA is saying, hey, if you have it, you don't need it. Dotted extension lines, well, that is usually considered a lane line or maybe even a longitudinal line, but they are not included in this. These are the extension or guidelines that go through an intersection that guides the vehicles to the next lane. Next is curb markings. They are not included. In shared use paths, they are not included, such as bike lanes and so forth. Parking spaces, they are not included. Transverse markings. Remember, I have a little problem with ambient illumination. I have a problem with transverse markings because transverse markings are critical lines. They're usually stop bars, and stop bars really need to be seen so that people do not bolt through an intersection. So I hope to see that change. Word, symbol, and arrow markings are not required to keep at or maintain at the minimum 50 millicandela level, and neither are crosswalks. Crosswalks and transverse lines are the two areas that I have concern with. Crosswalks, where the pedestrian is crossing, we have a lot of pedestrian deaths and impacts here in the United States This is concerning. I'm hoping again that we'll see the transverse lines and the crosswalk markings changed in the near future, that they will fall under the minimum, but for now they do not have to be maintained at 50 millicandela. Chevron diagonal crosshatch markings, these do not either. Now, my assumption in this that the chevron or the diagonal crosshatch within the, let's say, a gore, do not, but if those gore lines, those outside lines, are considered part of the lane lines or the longitudinal lines, those would be included. Same thing with shared use paths. You would want to make sure that if it's a bike lane and you've got a line dividing the bike lane and the travel lane of the vehicle, that certainly would still be, as I would understand it, would still be required to be maintained at a minimum level because it is a longitudinal lane line. However, also note that all markings have to be retroreflective. That's been in the MUTCD for quite some time. So it just says that these are markings that don't have to be maintained at that minimum 50 or 100 millicandela. All right, there are some circumstantial grace areas. I call it circumstantial grace, basically saying that there are some times when they understand that you will not be at these minimum levels. One is isolated locations of abnormal degradation. This could be where you have a lot of truck traffic coming into a roadway, and then of course that section there is going to get really obliterated, or it's going to degrade very quickly. So things like that could definitely cause some circumstantial grace. Next is periods preceding imminent resurfacing or reconstruction. These are areas in which obviously if you're about to do an overlay in 6 months or 3 months or something like that, you don't want to go out and spend tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars in doing a pavement marking program or remarking that road and then overlaying it afterwards. Now, I will say there are methods in which you can put temporary striping down for that period. I would highly recommend, but they're saying, hey, we understand that if you're about to reconstruct or there's imminent resurfacing going to be happening, then we would expect, we would understand and give you grace for that. Next is breakdowns, material shortages, and contracting problems. This is actually really, to be honest with you, the most relevant in our world. Breakdowns because right now we can't get truck parts, material shortages because we can't get materials, and contracting problems because we can't get labor. So there are some understandings, and I'm glad they built this in because this is a real life problem. Along with this is a real life problem as well, which is loss of retro from snow maintenance ops. They understand that there's going to be a period in which you may fall below the minimum after a snow season or a plow season. However, in all these cases, reasonable course of action is taken to resume maintenance of minimum retroreflectivity in a timely manner. What it's saying is, hey, we understand these things, but you better have something in play to take care of this situation in a timely manner. Now, there are a lot of ambiguous words in this: reasonable course, timely manner. I think that's probably intentional. Sometimes we put ambiguous wording in something intentionally so that it's a little easier to manage and not ruling with an iron fist. But anyway, the point is that these you do have some grace on. However, you need to have something in play to take care of these situations. So how do we stay compliant? How do we manage? How do we maintain the retroreflectivity of our markings? Well, the FHWA gives us a few options. One is, of course, to measure it with a retroreflectometer. Go out with a handheld or mobile and measure it. This is I prefer this one mainly because it's kind of a zero error type situation. You're going to go out there, you've got a number to go with. There's no personal judgment. There's no, you'll see some of the other issues with the other ones. This, of course, is probably, it is the best method. However, there is a capital expenditure oftentimes associated with getting a retroreflectometer. So FHWA said, hey, let's do some other things. Let's offer some other options as well. Some I'm not too keen on. For instance, this is consistent parameters nighttime visual inspection. Basically, this is you train a 60-year-old or greater or older person, and they come out and they drive your roads at night, and by personal judgment, they decide if that marking is visible enough for them. The other is a calibrated pavement marking nighttime visual inspection, which is very similar to the consistent parameters, except you don't have to have a 60-year-old person do it. You basically have a person go in and they calibrate their eyes to what a level of retroreflectivity should be at or greater than what it should be. And they calibrate their eyes. Basically, they have visual memory of what that is, and then they go out and drive the roads and they try to determine what lines are not meeting that visual memory. Very concerning to me. Again, there's a lot of personal judgment in here. Next is service life based on historical data. So if you're an agency that has a lot of data on historical data on your markings, the marking materials, on what type of pavements, what type of bead packages, all these kind of things, if you've got this data, you can put it together and you can use it to determine when you will restripe your road. For instance, if you find that waterborne paint with a type 1 bead at 25 mils installation on concrete, new concrete, lasts for 2 years, then you can say, okay, for those applications that are the same as this, then we show that it lasts for 2 years, then we can replace that every 2 years. The problem with this is that not all applications are created equally. One concrete is different than another concrete. One paint is different than a paint. Of course, the marking materials can be different. The beads can be different of quality and resins and all this kind of stuff. So I do have concern with that, along with a little bit of a concern of the same thing. This is the service life based on monitored markings. So instead of historical data, this is on monitored markings. So basically, if your agency doesn't have that historic data, which a lot of the local agencies do not, they will be able to, let's say, select a road that is very similar to other roads, and they can use that and monitor that to determine with that type of marking, that type of pavement, that type of bead package, so on and so forth. If that one wears out in a year and a half, then this one will need to be replaced in a year and a half because it's similar to that. This is great or better for those agencies that don't have the historical data, but again, we still have the same problem of not all applications are created equal. Rarely do you have two roads that are both concrete, that have both been painted in the same way, with the same paint, the same brand paint, and has the same ADT. So you're going to have some variations there. So there is some concerning areas there. The last one is really just a combination of all of these or any of these, and I think that this is really important to understand, because I kind of get the calibrated or the consistent parameters as long as somebody's going out there and kind of double checking. Well, you know, if it's obvious that it needs to be replaced, it's obviously replaced. And if it's borderline, then you go out there with a retroreflectometer and you make sure that it's meeting it. And then there is some obvious lines. So these personal judgment things aren't that bad if they're combined with an actual measurement. There's also room here to develop methods based on engineering studies. This is really important and really good because there are some things that's coming up out there, some scanning devices and so forth in the future that probably would fall under this, and I'm glad they left it open to be able to create a new method if they can prove that it does work. What's not recommended, so that's what's recommended on how to do it. This is what's recommended not to use. One is over the sun's shoulder, sun over the shoulder. This is a practice that people will do. They'll stand and the sun will be over their back, and they'll look at the line and they see that light reflecting off those beads onto, and you think, wow, that's great. Well, there's a couple things wrong with that, and the reason that they say that this is not the way to go. One is that that's not the same angles that we see the sun's up here. It's not 30-meter geometry. Your eyes are here, you know, and you're looking down at this line. So it's not 30-meter geometry, number one. And number two is that the intensity of that sun is quite a bit more than that of, I mean, that sun will reflect off almost anything because of the brightness, the luminance that's coming off the sun. So that's another reason. I still like the concept only for looking at bead distribution, because then you can see if you're edge to edge with beads, because what will happen if you're not adequately covering that line, and sometimes that bead gun will be off, and you'll only have part of that line covered with beads. And if you do, then that, let's say that line is normally 6 inches, it's going to reflect at 2 inches if it's not adequately covered. So I do like the sun over shoulder only for the use of making sure that you have good bead distribution. Next is the comparison panel. This is basically the idea of having a panel that, and they did this with signs. They allowed you to have a panel at or above the minimum, and you would take that reflective panel, you put it on, clip it onto the sign, you get back and you put your flashlight up to your eyes and you take a look at that sign and see if that sign was brighter than that particular panel. Well, they don't want you to do this with markings because they don't want you to run out in the middle of the road, put a panel down, run back in the middle of the road and check it. So they're saying it's just too risky for the inspectors. Next is the lane line count. I kind of liked this in the beginning, and I understand why they don't want to do it, but basically what they're saying is we need 2.2 seconds, I think it's 2.2 seconds of reaction time. So you need to be able to see the markings far enough ahead, depending on what speed you're going, far enough ahead that you can respond and react to what you're seeing. So pavement markings, let's say 60 miles an hour, somewhere around a little over 200 feet. So let's say 210 feet. So what you do is you would say in this idea, this is using skip lines as a way of measurement. So if your skip line cycle is, let's say 40 feet, it'd be 10 foot of line, 30 foot of skip, 10 foot of line, 30 foot of skip. And that varies from state to state sometimes. But let's say it's 40 foot and you've got 200 feet. So you know you need 5 cycles, 5 skip cycles. You need to be able to see as far as 5 skip cycles. So it's really cool. It's actually kind of a neat method, but they don't recommend it because of a couple of things. One is not all roads have skip lines. And secondly, because it's very difficult to keep track of where that fifth skip cycle is. So it could be very distracting and just hard to keep up with that. But there's another way in which the idea would, and I thought of this too, I thought, well, why don't we just put a piece of tape on the window and say, I should be able to see that that's measuring at 210 feet, 200 feet. And as long as I can see that marking all the way up to the tape on that windshield, then that'll work. Well, what they're saying is that, okay, we don't like this because in great part because they're concerned of the movement of the driver. So if the driver, let's say he gets tired, he starts slumping over a little bit, or he's looking back and forth, that slight movement here creates many feet difference down there, 30 meters out, or 200 feet out, because that's really what you're looking at. So I understand why they don't do that. Again, if they're allowing these others, this doesn't seem so bad, but I get it. I understand it. Next is control markings. So in signs, again, you were able to, like let's say you're going to put out a batch of 100 stop signs. You're going to install all those throughout your city. And you would take, or in a section of your city, you take one stop sign out of that batch, you put it in your yard, and you monitor that sign with a retroreflectometer. And then all the other signs, when this sign failed, all these other signs would have to be replaced. Now, there is some inherent problems with that, even with signs, because it depends on the direction of the sign, where it's facing. If it's a southward facing sign, it could get a lot more UV exposure, therefore it could fail. So I would put that sign in a southern facing direction. But the problem with markings is that markings have degradation based on their environment. And you actually have an ADT, you have a car, you have cars, thousands of cars driving over this. So you can't really put a line in your yard and expect that the line out in the field is going to perform just as well. Then there is comparison light box. Now, comparison light box is pretty cool. It's like a manual retroreflectometer. We used to sell them, and you look down, you shine a light, it's got some mirrors, and you compare it to another panel and so forth. The problem is you have to get on your hands and knees looking down at this in the middle of the night, in the middle of the road. They don't like it because it's unsafe for those inspectors. So, of course, this is my presentation, so I get to give you some of my predictions. And this is some good things that I see that could possibly occur. First of all, there will be a substantial increase in the pavement marking business. So if you are a material supplier, an installer, or someone that does assessments for pavement markings, this is going to be a good time because business will increase substantially, because a lot of agencies are not focused on their pavement markings as far as maintaining their minimum retroreflectivity. Next is, I do believe we will have safer roads. There will be improved visibility on local agency and rural roads. So I'm excited about that because markings are going to be looked at a little different. Again, here, improved focus on marking materials and applications quality. So now that this minimum has to be maintained, excuse me, and that these minimums need to be maintained, we're going to be watching them a little bit closer, and we're going to make sure that that material is actually a durable material and that application is done properly. Next is safer operations of machine-driven vehicles. As I said earlier, really those markings are like the rails of a train. They are the rails of a connected automated vehicle or machine-driven vehicle. So we're going to have safer operations of those vehicles. And again, those vehicles that we buy and drive today will be able to manage their lane positioning better because there'll be better markings. I do not believe that there will be a gold rush on this. I don't think that next year every agency will have something or will be in compliance or have a maintenance or an assessment system put in place. So I subscribe to something called the Rogers diffusion curve. This is for integration of innovation or change within a society. In this particular case, I do believe by the first full year, by year one, at the end of year one, select states and forward-thinking locals will have a program in place. That's about 2.5% of the market. These are agencies that already have programs in development and just those forward-thinking locals that have the money to do it and have the time and the ability to do it and have the interest in doing it. Then you have your early adopters. I think by year two, end of year two, about 13.5% more will have joined the group in having a compliance or being compliant, and that will be most states. I believe pretty much every state has been looking at minimums up to now, and I think we'll see that most states by the end of year two will have some type of program in place. And then I believe that many major or some major locals will as well, and as well as some of the minor locals that are forward thinking. Back to early majority, 34% by year three. So now we're up to nearly 50, a little over 50%. Will be in play by the end of year three, and these will be all states at this point will have a plan in place, and major locals will have a plan in place, and there will be some minor locals as well. And then by the late majority will come in between year 3 and 4. That's another 34%, and that is the most minor locals will now be compliant, all states and all major locals. You will have those laggards, about 16%, and this really kind of came out with the sign management requirement. These numbers are probably pretty accurate with that. And these are the folks that kind of get to that year 4 and they go, oh, crud, I got to get out there and I got to do something. So you'll see that. These are, we call them laggards. Wonderful name. You don't want to be called a laggard, but some of us are. Anyway, this is all state, all local agencies at this point will hopefully have a program in place. These are my predictions. Now, oh, one more thing. Transverse markings will be added in the next 3 years. So these transverse markings and crosswalks, my prediction is that FHWA will have in place transverse markings and crosswalk minimum requirements. Now, I figure if I preach this enough, that will, if I say it, it'll eventually happen, right? So that's what I'm hoping for, that we'll see those transverse lines. Now, understand transverse lines, especially those in a walking path, oftentimes have some type of grit or friction, something to increase the friction so that people don't slip and fall on the markings, and that does decrease retroreflectivity, but at a minimum of 50, pretty much that's an easy number to hit no matter really what you put in it. So as far as adding grit to your glass beads, won't affect it that much. Anyway, so there are my predictions. Now let's get to my concerns. My concerns that there will be some low minimum issues. Minimums not suitable for some concrete pavement markings. So what we found is in some cases where in our study, our Measure Across America study, we actually found concrete that was reflecting at 35-40 millicandela. So let's say you have a concrete that's at 35 millicandela, you have a marking that's 50 millicandela. The contrast, the nighttime contrast of those, the reflective contrast of those, is not very substantial, and therefore that marking will be hard to be seen by humans or by CAVs or those driver-assisted vehicles. So this is a concern that 50 is actually too low for those concrete pavement applications. Next is that this low minimum could create idleness among agencies, assuming that new and old markings easily pass. 50 millicandela. Now, I know that you guys have a sign program probably in place, and you go out there and you're like, man, this sign will never die. You've got 1980 signs out there that still meet that low minimum that was set. There could be an assumption that the markings will be the same, and so therefore we don't really have to manage them. We can just act like we are because even a piece of white paper will meet that standard, which is not true. A piece of white paper, depending on the texture, is around 10 to 12 millicandela. Next is agencies with higher or more appropriate numbers lowering their requirements. My biggest concern of all regarding low minimum issues is that there are most state agencies. I don't know of any agency that has a 50 millicandela minimum requirement that's one that is that low. I think the lowest I've seen is 100, and then that's what kicks off the maintenance program. But most of them are around 100, 150 for minimums, and then they go back in and their initials are 250 and 350. What I'm concerned about is, and it's already happened, so the concern has been justified, that a legislature will come through, or someone that's got the purse strings, and they'll say, hey, why are we spending so much money to keep our minimums up so high? If 50 millicandela is good enough for the feds, we're protected. It should be good enough for us, and therefore we don't have to spend the money to go out and replace 100 millicandela markings. We can replace them. We can wait another year and replace them when they get below 50. This is a big concern because it could lower the quality of markings throughout our system. Other marking characteristics may be overlooked. Another concern I have, because we can become too reliant. I'm a retroreflectivity guy, but we can become much too reliant on retroreflectivity as the only measured method of markings effectiveness and quality, which is not true. Retroreflectivity is a major part of that, but you have everything from contrast, color, texture. There's so adhesion, just presence alone. So there are some characteristics that we don't want to overlook as to what a good marking is beyond just its ability to reflect light. Especially this is a concern with contrast concerns over daytime operations of machine-driven vehicles. These are camera-based systems, and basically they struggle more to see white lines on, let's say, concrete in the day than they do at night, because retroreflectivity, any level of retroreflectivity, creates some type of nighttime contrast. But daytime contrast can be an issue. So that's something that's very critical. You can see that most states are now adopting contrast markings on their lighter colored pavements. I'm also concerned of excessive demand. Material and labor supply shortages already exist. We have this issue right now. Added to that with the IIJA spending and the new minimums, this will further strain our supply channels. And now with the Buy America requirement that 55%, I believe the number is 55% of our materials value has to be derived from the United States. So there's a lot of times that we're having to depend on our international partners to bring in enough materials, even during this shortage, and we still can't meet it. So you cut that supply chain off, and I see that we're going to have some issues. Labor, of course, an issue as well. So here are some suggestions to you local agencies and county agencies. Start now. Improve your pavement marking specifications or create pavement marking specifications. You can possibly mimic the requirements of your state when you do this. I'd be looking at my state or a neighboring state if your state hasn't put anything in yet, or talk to my folks in the state because they're likely already creating a plan, and mimic those and follow theirs, and I think you'll be satisfied with that. Train your team on proper pavement marking inspection. This is critical that they understand how to inspect a pavement marking. So not just its reflectivity, which is important, but also just overall. You've got its width, its color, its bead distribution, its thickness, depending on what type of material you're using. All those things can be really important to make sure that you have a quality marking that's going to provide retroreflectivity for the long run. Oh, by the way, on the training, the American Traffic Safety Service Association is putting out an inspection, pavement marking inspection course sometime soon. Well, I say soon, those inspection courses could take, it may be somewhere in the third quarter of 2023. So I am on that panel to help with that. So I'm really excited about that. I think it's going to be critical for moving on, especially for these local agencies that may not be familiar with pavement markings as much as they are with signs now, right? So we also need to begin requiring certification of initial minimum retroreflectivity on all new markings. And remember that there is a difference between initial and minimum maintenance. So most of your states have, let's say they have 250, 350, somewhere around there, millicandela requirement for initial, because they want that marking to last. Now there's no real track yet of a linear change. Sometimes it's a big drop in the beginning and then levels off and slowly degrades over time. It's different for different materials, different markings, different pavements. But the point is that you need to have those initial numbers high enough, require high enough initials that you will have, again, a long-lasting pavement marking that's seen by those nighttime drivers. Now, I know contractors won't like this very much, but I would require a certification, at least at a minimum, a self-certification, that they are able to tell you that this is at, let's say, 250 millicandela or higher. If they're working for your state, they may already have that requirement with the state. So adopting it to the city and county should not be a big issue. Next is monitor the new marking performance. So this is what I would go out every 6 months, every year after that marking is done, knowing what type of material it is, knowing what the bead package is on it, knowing what surface it's put on, knowing how old it is, when it was put in, and monitor that. Go out there with a retroreflectometer like every 6 months or a year and look at these lines and see how that material's performance, because that can build your data that you need to move forward in the future. You may have to tweak the initial minimums or improve your material specifications. Get access to a quality retroreflectometer. I think this is critical that you have a quality retroreflectometer on hand. Now, it may be that you don't need it on hand 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So going out and buying one may not be the solution. You might want to rent one. You might want to get one hardware as a service. These are all different things that how you can acquire these instruments. We offer hardware as a service, so that means it's like software as a service. So it's kind of like a guaranteed rental program and a lesser cost. Or you can rent the machine daily, weekly, monthly, or you can do a pool fund with other cities and counties, or you can just flat out buy it with your agency's funding. So, but I do strongly suggest getting a quality retroreflectometer, because all of those other options really boil down to you have to go back out and make sure you're right, especially on those that you're not really sure if it meets it or not through your visual and personal judgment. So here's a quick summary. This is a great chart that's supplied by the Federal Highway Administration. And what I really like about what they've done on this, as you saw, there were some things that I have concerns with, but I like the simplicity of this, because like the sign retroreflectivity requirements depended on the type of material, what sign it was, what color it was. They've made this very simple. They said, if it's 35 or below, we don't have to worry about it, okay? If it's above 35, it's got to be 50 millicandela. And if it's above 70 miles per hour, it's got to be 100 millicandela. And here are some optional exclusions. I want to put emphasis on optional. It doesn't mean that you don't do it. It's optional exclusions. So for roadways that are less than 6,000 ADT. Now, let me tell you, if you have a 5,500 ADT, I would be establishing or managing those lines as well, because they have to be seen just like one at 6,000. Dotted extension lines, curb markings, shared use paths, ambient lighting. We won't go through that again. These are optional exclusions. This chart's available on these sites. You'll see these are the resources. Now, what I highly recommend is going down to this last one, which says PPP FHWA Pavement Marking Management Resource page. Now, that page has been changed to Pavement Marking Resource Center, and it has all the FHWA, all these documents plus other documents, plus other sources, resources for you. So I would highly recommend going to that. It's still at this address. It's just renamed, and it's still at this particular, using this particular QR code. So if you want to scan that and go to that, you'll get all the information, and that is updated regularly. The other thing is that this says coming soon, but we have already presented it. This is the Measure Across America Project presentation on Retroreflectivity 101, and we've had rave reviews on this. If you would like to know more about retroreflectivity, definitely something that you should attend. And this is my information on how to contact me. This is my email address, of course, our website, and our LinkedIn. I would strongly suggest, if you're on LinkedIn, please follow me, because I make regular posts with regards to pavement marking and all sorts of road construction or road safety infrastructure items and subjects. Obviously, there's no questions that I can answer here, but please reach out to me through my LinkedIn or through email. Ask any questions that you may have regarding the FHWA standard that is now in place. With that, we are complete. Thank you so much for your last 41 minutes and 24 seconds of time, and I appreciate it, and I respect, and I feel honored that you spent this time with me. And if there's any questions that you have, any needs that you have beyond this, please feel free to contact me at greg.driscoll@pppcatalog.com. Until then, have a safe day, and go out and make your roads safer for the fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters that use and work on them every day. Thank you, and God bless.